Hi all, today I'm talking to you a little bit about what it means to be a photographer, and I am answering the questions that were left in the discussion group back in week 11. So, before I really get into it, um, there's a pretty small likelihood that any of this stuff will be included on the final exam. That said, maybe I'll throw in a little question or two. I haven't finalized the question set yet. However, this is just mostly for your own enjoyment and amusement. So, um, you know, hopefully you'll enjoy the discussion. Yet, don't feel too obligated to focus on any of the details. And I guess the last thing I wanted to say is if there's something I say here today that you want to follow up, by all means, let me know. And probably the best thing to do is just go ahead and either drop me an email, or you can reply to the week 11 post, and I'll see if there's any new questions there, and I'll answer them. So we're going to start off here, and let's see, the first person here is Carson. The questions are: I was curious to know how difficult it is to photograph pets. How do you get them to stay still enough for a photo to focus on you? What are your fine art subjects? Do you also like taking pictures of landscapes? If you could go any place in the world to take a photo, a place you have or have not been, where would it be and what? So it's a lot of questions. They're all rolled into one. Pets are certainly a big part of what I do. And before I can get into the questions in general, it's important to note that with anything that you do, it's really a lot of practice involved. And so the more you do anything, the easier it is. And so, at this point, unless I have a really, really, really difficult pet, I have to say it's really not that difficult. The way that I usually will set up is, if it's a studio, if it's a location shot, then I usually bring a little external flash and use that to fill the shadows. But if it's a studio setup, I'll have a seamless background and a couple of 2 or 3 studio lights with strobes. And I'll show you a picture here in just a sec. So here's a setup. This isn't my usual setup. This is kind of a what I call the fake room setup, and it's pretty similar to what I would normally do with the white background, which would give you this kind of an effect. Basically, instead of having wallpaper and tile flooring here, I would have just a white seamless background. And typically I wouldn't use a scaffolding. I just set up a little table, and basically I'd use like a 4-foot by 8-foot sheet of plywood on sawhorses, and using the seamless makes it so that you don't have any obvious corners. Having a couple of studio strobes on either side makes for a pretty even lighting, which makes it easier to photograph pets, because if they move around a little bit, then it doesn't matter. In terms of how hard it is, the first part is that if you have enough light, then you only need a fraction of a second to capture these expressions. And for this example here, or probably any of these, I would have shot for maybe 1/200th of a second. And so you don't have to stand still very long in order to get that kind of a frozen movement. Now, in terms of what do I do to get them focused on you, there's really 2 different approaches. If I work myself, it's actually pretty easy. By putting, I work in a room where the animals can't escape, and that's definitely important. But when I work alone, I don't have any distractions, and so it's really kind of all about me. Sure, there's definitely some animals that are kind of nervous and will just kind of want to run and hide. But for the most part, animals, and especially ones that are pets that are used to living with people or are up for adoption, they like to have that kind of interaction, and so they will naturally kind of look to you. Sometimes you're going to want to have little treats, sometimes you want little toys, but um, these are little tips and tricks that you get when you start to work with the animals for a little bit. Now, for some of the images where they're looking away, that's generally a pretty good indication that I'm using or kind of running away. It's usually a pretty good indication that I'm not working alone for those ones. And for those photographs, I tend to have an assistant playing with toys so that I can capture some nice movement and play. Obviously, sometimes if you have more than one animal, they kind of interact with each other. But working with a toy that they enjoy will get you some really nice movements, and that's a nice way to add a little extra interest to your shooting. In terms of fine art subjects, it just kind of depends. I definitely do some landscape stuff, so this is infrared. For those of you who may or may not be interested in it, in what infrared light is, just to the left of the spectrum of visible light. So visible light would be all of the red, orange, yellow that you learned about colors of the rainbow. Just to the very near left of that is going to be the infrared spectrum. And the infrared spectrum of light can go from, kind of like the night vision, heat-seeking kind of things, to colors that we can't see, but are actually more, much closer to what the visible light spectrum is than compared to like what you would see with the heat. So those are the photographs that were taken with a specially modified camera to do this kind of thing. For escapes, this is some of my animal work. You can see we're just focusing on certain aspects of the animal that I think is interesting. It gives you a little different perspective. This is a kind of more of an environmental series where I've been working on. It's kind of sad for people who haven't lived in Tucson before. When you're used to the Columbia, the Snake, and the Yakima, there's lots and lots and lots of water in the Tri-Cities. When you come to someplace like Tucson, Arizona, what they call is rivers are actually former rivers. And when we get the monsoons, then they'll fill up with water briefly before the water soaks into the ground. And because of the way that it works, all of the city streets, everything will kind of flow into these washes, and you just get a whole bunch of pollution. And so this particular series is kind of highlighting some of that destructive polluting influences that we have here in Tucson, Arizona. You'll probably notice that this series has a little bit of a color shift. Those kinds of things are intentional, and it makes everything feel a little bit off kilter. Kind of interesting. Lots and lots of mattresses, lots and lots of carts. This is kind of the way that it seems to go here. I also have series of color landscapes. Anytime that I'm getting ready to leave and move away from an area, I start to photograph it pretty extensively as a kind of visual reminder. And so, views here from the Tri-Cities. I love to do macro work, getting in really close. And so these are some desert macros. So you can see I have a variety of things that I enjoy. This one here is one of my more abstract fine art projects. So yes, definitely like to do landscapes, and if I could go anywhere in the world to take a photo, well, I'm a homebody, so I like to photograph where I live, and so the places that I like to photograph are the places that I've lived before. So Tucson here, certainly the Tri-Cities when I go back to visit and check up on my house there. I photograph the Tri-Cities, or I used to live in Kentucky or Virginia. Those are the kind of places that I like to go visit. Definitely it's fun to take the camera along when I go traveling, exploring new places, but in terms of the places that I really enjoy are the kinds of are the places that I've lived before, basically. I know them, I know what to look for. No, thanks for your questions. Okay, so the next questions here are, did I take photography classes throughout high school? And what age was I when I became a photographer unprofessional? And how do I figure out the different lights and exposures to use in a shoot? Um, Basically, I didn't start taking images until well after college, and so I didn't take any classes at all until I was I don't know, probably 30, 35, somewhere in there. And you know, kind of all started, I bought a camera in advance of a trip to Hawaii and just kind of fell in love with it. So you know, that probably would have been, geez, maybe 2003, so relatively recent. And really enjoyed it, and started taking a couple classes, and realized that I enjoyed it so well that I wanted to go back and pursue it professionally and earn my MFA. So by the time that I graduated, that was 2009. You can see it was a pretty short little window, and certainly, you know, I was taking classes part-time rather than going full-time, so it's a relatively narrow window. In terms of figuring out different lights and exposures, pretty much trial and error. I really enjoy studio lighting, and the reason I like the studio so well is because it allows me to create whatever I want to create, rather than kind of being at the mercy of, you know, if it's sunny out, if it's cloudy, whatever. And you know, sure, I enjoy shooting with natural light too, don't get me wrong, but using studio light allows me to make the exact light that I want. And that's kind of a powerful sort of thing for an artist. Anytime that you have control, or if you have control, that maybe you want to, you know, once you have that control, then maybe you decide that you want to, you know, kind of let it go and kind of take random chance, and then that's fine. But being able to precisely decide all the different variables is kind of a powerful thing. And so definitely there's a lot of experimenting. And in terms of exposures, there's a lot of people out there who think you need to shoot in manual mode in order to be a good photographer. And absolutely, I think that there are some circumstances where you want to take full control of the camera, whether you're deciding your exposures, your shutter speed and aperture settings. But you know, by and large, these cameras today are pretty sophisticated, and so the shooting modes, the semi-automatic ones like aperture priority or shutter speed, are ones that I recommend for most shooting, because the camera does a pretty good job metering. And so for those situations, especially for somebody who's just starting out, I say, you know, put it in aperture priority, because that allows you to select your depth of field, and that's a very important consideration for a photographer. You want to decide what's in focus and what's not, and you take a shot. And if it's underexposed, you know, you can look at the back of the camera, you can look at the histogram. Don't rely too much on the picture itself, because the different light that you look at on the LCD can affect your judgment. But you know, basically, if it looks like it's a little bit underexposed, and you need to judge what the important part is. So if you're taking pictures of your friends out in the landscape on a bright sunny day, chances are you're going to need to increase the exposure a little bit in order to get good exposure on the faces. And so then you might need to bump up the exposure a little bit from there. So the camera does a pretty good job metering, but on you know, times where it's really important to be precise, you know, the first time you don't have time to experiment, then it's appropriate to use a secondary device. And a light meter is relatively, you know, relative, being, you know, camera expensive, camera gear is always expensive, a relatively inexpensive tool, and it will tell you, what your setting is. So if I know I want to shoot with an open aperture of say f2.8, I can set that on my light meter, take a quick reading, it'll tell me what the shutter speed should be, and that's the easiest way to know, to dial into a pretty close where you should be. So with everything it takes practice, but trial and error. You can read so much in the books and you can understand the theory, but it's really getting out there and doing it to know, to really get comfortable in knowing what your different exposures should be. So how did I get into the art of photography? Was it family, or discovered I had passion for it? Was it difficult to photograph pets? Hard to get them to sit still? So I kind of already covered some of these to a certain extent. When I bought that first camera, before I went to Hawaii, and it just something really just clicked. At that point, I was kind of looking for a creative outlet. I had been working I was doing cancer research for a number of years, and kind of retired from that when my wife finished her training, and took a little bit of time to sort of kind of rediscover myself. And I found that camera, and because I was retired at that point, I thought, well, I'll take a few classes, and I just enjoyed it so well that I decided that I should enroll in the degree program. When you go, well, if you ever decide that you want to be an artist, and to specifically to go to school for that, it's really important that you look at the different programs. Now, I kind of got lucky, I think, and the school I went to was the Academy of Art University out in California. There are a lot of really good schools, and of course, state schools are all going to have pretty solid programs. I know that the Tri-Cities campus doesn't have anything, but if you go to Pullman, then you can get into some pretty serious programs there, and there's definitely some good ones around the country. But if like me, you wanted to have the convenience of an online education, there's really only a handful of places that will do that. Academy of Art is one. The Art Institute is one through their Pittsburgh campus. And if you decide to do that, I think it's important that you look and understand what their curriculum is. So, for example, I in addition to teaching at WSU, I also teach at the Art Institute. And so I've been able to learn as an instructor there that is a very technically oriented program. You learn how to use your camera, you learn how to set your lights, you learn how to use Photoshop and Lightroom. Whereas for the Academy of Art University, where I went to, and again, it was luck, I didn't understand this at the time, but that is an art school. And so, yeah, sure, you learn, one class on kind of this is how you use your camera, but mostly you learn about art. You learn about art history. You learn about compositions. You learn about narrative and creating mood. And because I went to a school like that, it was never about the the lighting ratios or whatever. It was all about creating your vision, and that is really kind of how I got into the art of photography. When I started school, at that point I was taking lots of pictures of my dog. She was sick with cancer, and I wanted to make sure that I had lots of photographs to remember her by. And I was taking pictures of landscapes and flowers and things that people like to do. Once I got to school is when I started to really think about what sorts of things really interest me visually, and I've never done that before I went to school. And I started to do that a little bit when I was taking classes, just kind of personal enrichment, but definitely once I got into graduate school, it was all about finding my vision as an artist, and that's really how I got into the art of photography. And so I definitely don't have any family that does any of this, and it was just kind of an accidental sort of thing where I found it. When I bought that first camera, it was the original Digital Rebel, and if you're not familiar with that, you can check out versions of that from the school, from in the Mac lab, and you can see that in the class homepage. But the ones that you can check out from school are basically just, geez, probably 5 or 6 versions past what that original one was that I bought. And I think had I bought just a point and shoot camera, I probably would have missed out on all of that. But because I bought one where I could change the lenses, it kind of appealed to both my geeky technical side, and again, I did cancer research, and so that I think that kind of says a little something about my personality. So having the control and all that kind of thing, because I chose a camera that was kind of appealed to the geeky nature of me, it allowed me to kind of find the artistic side to me. Is it difficult to photograph pets? I definitely kind of went in that already. It just takes some practice. If you are an animal person, then I truly believe that you can take good photographs of pets. If you don't know how to interact with animals, then I think it would be extraordinarily difficult. In terms of the things that you might consider if you're interested, make sure that your background is not cluttered. Make sure there's plenty of light, especially black dogs. They can be very, very difficult to photograph if you don't have enough light. On-camera flash is almost always a bad idea. That's when you get the glowing green eyes, or for people you get the red eyes. And while there are some pretty good red eye removing tools, there is nothing out there that's a good pet green eye removal tool. So using off-camera light if you need it, and kind of eliminating clutter, those are the kinds of things that'll make your photographs look really nice. And in terms of is it easy? If you know pets, if you know dogs, you know cats, then I think that it's not so hard. In terms of getting them to sit still, using studio lighting, my exposures are all 1/200th of a second, so I don't need them to sit still very long. If you anticipate, you tell them sit, you have your treat or your toy or whatever, that butt hits the ground, boom, that's when you take the picture. And even if they immediately get back up, then you can still get the sitting still shot. So it just depends on the animal. Some are harder than others. Some of them are always going to be eager to please, and some of them are better trained. But basically, the answer to that one is it just depends. But mostly it's not that bad. Okay, so what's my favorite lens? How do I educate myself to be? And we kind of missed out on some of the question there. So in terms of my favorite lens, it just depends, and it depends on what I'm doing. The macro lens is something that I enjoy. One of the things I enjoy basically is getting close and showing things that people haven't seen before. And so when you shoot with a macro, it gives people a different perspective on sometimes very ordinary kind of objects. And so for that reason, I have a 180 millimeter macro lens. It's a Tamron, so relatively inexpensive, but still a very nice lens, and I like that one quite well. My regular go-to lens is a 24 to 105 millimeter lens, and I like that. It's a walk-around lens because it has a nice range from wide angle to do a relatively short telephoto, and so you can get some pretty good variations there. And here I'll show you an example of something like that. Okay, so here's a photo I took this past weekend. A friend asked me to photograph her daughter and her horse doing some events at the county fair. And this is my 24-105 lens. Here, she's walking the horse backwards through the arena. So here we're probably 70 yards away. You can see we get some pretty good detail, so you get pretty good reach from the lens. On the other hand, let's see, kind of zoom in. You can get some nice detail shots too. So this would be a little bit closer, and this is about a 50 millimeter. You can get some nice detail shots close up, and you can still get some nice wide angle shots to give a sense of the scene. So here would be an example of a wider angle shot where you relatively close to the main subjects here, but you get a sense of the scene. So definitely a lens that I like. How do I educate myself? I'm assuming to take better pictures. There are a number of things that I do for continuing education. First of all, I'm a member of the Professional Photographers of America, and they have a series of educational webinars online, and so I can learn new techniques that way. I subscribe to lynda.com, L-Y-N-D-A, and that's a great way to keep abreast of new programs and techniques. So for example, I've long been a macro photographer, and one of the things that you can do is turn your regular lens around to take macro photographs, but I've never tried that. And I was kind of curious about it, but I've got a macro lens, so I was like, well, why would I do that? So I watched a little half-hour video on that, and so now I have a better understanding of why that might be a better approach than using my regular macro lens. So things like that, and of course keeping abreast of the journals. I subscribe to Photo District News, which is more about the commercial work, and Professional Photographer, which is more about regular portraits and weddings and that kind of stuff. So let's see what we got.